There is a deep sense of unease in our rapidly changing world. We all know something has been lost, but we don't know why or where it all leads. Popular culture tells us it is all about me, and that we should worship our creations rather than the Creator. In politics, the end justifies the means. In relationships, love means self-satisfaction. In life, status and appearance are what count. In the church, confusion replaces clarity and conviction. Our faulty and distorted view of God is at the root of all our problems within and without. But what if we viewed God differently? What if we saw him the way he longed for us to see him? Instead of worshiping a comfortable golden calf of our own creation, we can worship a God that is holy, wise, and just, one whose faithfulness and goodness are matched by his power and sovereignty over all things. This is a God that can deliver us from evil and transform lives. This is a God worth worshiping. The way back, the path of hope, starts with knowing God for who he really is. We need to know the real God.
Well, good morning. It is great to see you this morning. Today we're in week 3 of a sermon series called Real God. And after a week of introduction, last week we started with 7 of the attributes of God. Now, an attribute of God means that this is how we define God. It's irreducible. God cannot be defined without these 7 things that we're going to talk about. Last week we talked about how God is a good God. We looked at the goodness of God. And in fact, God defines what good is. We define good differently than God does. We define good by how something is bad, all right? So we contrast the good with bad. So we determine, hey, I'm a good person because I've never been on America's Most Wanted, right? Or the Magic are a bad basketball team because most teams, high school teams, could beat them. I mean, but here's how crazy it is on the way we define good. I can fail 70% of the time, but if I can hit the baseball 30% of the time I get up to the plate, I am so good, they're going to give me a multi-million-dollar contract even though I fail 70% of the time. That's how wacky we define good. Understand, when we talk about God being good, we're talking about his omnibenevolence, that there is no bad in God, and we don't compare God's goodness to anything else except who he is and his character. Today we're looking at another attribute, and this attribute is the sovereignty of God. And in your notes, let's look at the definition we put in here. What does it mean for God to be sovereign? Well, it means this: God's divine control over everything that happens. Now, understand this. God has divine control over everything that happens. That doesn't mean God divinely controls everything that happens. Understand the distinction there. But he does have divine control over everything that happens. Look at the way the psalmist said it in Psalm 115 there at the top of your notes. He just made it very clear. Our God is in heaven, and he does whatever he pleases. You can't get much simpler than that. But that truly is what it means to be sovereign. Our God is in heaven, and he does whatever he pleases. Now, when we talk about the sovereignty of God, we're talking about the fact that God knows all, he sees all, he's all powerful, and he is all active, and his will always be done. His desire, he knows what's going to happen. And when we talk about sovereignty, we also need to address the elephant in the room, because when it comes to evangelicals today, there's this tension between, well, how sovereign is God? And that's really the wrong question, because God is totally sovereign. The real question is, does God give man any free will? And there's 2 camps that are very extreme. And let me just say this, it's cautious to go to either extreme in either of the 2 camps. and to take the mystery of the gospel, as Paul calls it, and all of who God is, and reduce it down to 5 points is really not wise. But just so you know what's out there, there's a certain extreme that says, yeah, God is the creator, he's in total control, but basically he leaves you to make every decision on your life. What happens in your life is all a result of your decisions, and you've got to work your way to heaven. Now, they wouldn't say it that way, but that's exactly what they mean, because they say that you could lose your salvation. If you got bad enough, you would lose your salvation, so you better perform to please God. And it totally ignores some scripture, or tries to redefine some scripture. One that comes to mind is Ephesians 2:8-9. For it's by grace you have been saved by faith, not of works, lest anyone should boast. Well, if I have to constantly please God through the way that I live my life, that is works, and that does negate grace. And that's one extreme. But the other extreme would say that God is so sovereign and so in control that you have no decisions in life. He has already predetermined everything that's going to happen. And now, understand this, there's a difference between predetermined and pre-knew. His foreknowledge, nobody questions his foreknowledge. He knows everything. We're going to look at that in just a minute. But I heard a preacher on this who's on this extreme. He actually said this in a message. He said, God is so sovereign that when you play Scrabble, he determines the tiles that you're going to pull. So he's already determined who's going to win that game in his sovereignty. And so as you can see, there's some danger on either extreme. And so we're going to let the Bible speak to us, let God reveal his sovereignty to us through his words. In your notes, let's talk about how do we know that God is sovereign. And we're looking at Isaiah chapter 46, just 3 verses there, but understand chapter 45 and 46 of Isaiah are one thought. Isaiah is a prophet writing to Judah, which is the southern kingdom of Israel. And he is writing and saying, look, if you don't turn back to God, God's going to bring his judgment on the nation. And so he's writing this, and in these 3 verses, I believe God reveals his sovereignty in several ways. First of all, in your notes, he claims it. God claims his sovereignty, starting in verse 9. Look at what he says. He says, remember what happened long ago, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and no one is like me. God first here is defining himself, and you know the rule. If God says something, it's important. We should listen to it. If God says it twice, we better really pay attention. And he's saying here, look, I'm God. No one's like me. I am God. There is no other. He is letting us know that he is distinct, that he is sovereign. And in these verses, we're going to see that God is going to reveal some future events that are going to happen. Like I said, Judah has rebelled against the Lord, and Isaiah is prophesying about how God is going to bring his discipline on Judah, which, by the way, isn't going to happen for another 150 years. And he even talks about how that's going to come. In these 2 chapters, he talks about the Babylonians. And it would be the Babylonians that God's going to use in about 70, 75 years to come and bring his discipline on Judah. And Isaiah is already writing about it 75 years before the event's going to happen. And in the first part of chapter 46, he says, look, this is how foolish what you're doing is. The Babylonians, they carry around idols. You guys are worshiping idols. Understand this, they carry idols around with them, worshiping them as gods. But when I send my judgment on Babylon, the gods aren't going to save them. Those idols aren't going to save them. In fact, they're going to carry those idols out with them, and they're going to have to carry their gods who did them no good when I send my judgment. So why are you trusting in idols like that? You need to put your trust in God. Put your trust in me. And he's saying, look, there's no one like me. There's no other one like me. And he claims here his sovereignty because he's talking about future events. Secondly, he defines it. God defines his sovereignty in one of the aspects. And look at how he defines it. He says, I declare the end from the beginning and from long ago what is not yet done, saying, my plan will take place and I will do all my will. Here's what God is saying. I am sovereign and I already know that you're not going to turn to me, and I already know how I'm going to bring my discipline on you as a nation, and I'm already putting things in place to make that happen. And nothing can stop my plan. And then thirdly, what we see here is God illustrates it. God illustrates. He even tells them how he's going to bring his discipline on them. And again, this is not going to happen for about 75 years. And what he's talking about here is not going to happen for another 150 years. He says this in verse 11. He says, I call a bird of prey from the east. Now, when they heard bird of prey, they thought swift and powerful. So he's saying, I'm going to call a man who is swift and powerful from the east, a man for my purpose from a far country. Yes, I have spoken, so I will also bring it about. I have planned it. I will also do it. Now, here's the crazy thing. If you go to chapter 45, God has already told us who that person's going to be. And that person is going to be Cyrus, king of Persia. And he's saying this. He's saying the Babylonians who carry idols, they're going to come in, and I'm going to use them to bring my discipline on you. They're going to bring you into exile. That's how Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego got in Babylon. And he says, and then I'm going to take King Cyrus of Persia, and he's going to bring my discipline on Babylon, and he's going to overtake Babylon, and it's not going to happen for 150 years. But he names places and how it's going to happen, showing his sovereignty. God is a sovereign God. And here's some things to think about. First of all, God is sovereign over time. He says from the very end, I know the end from the beginning. Because in my foreknowledge, I already know everything's going to happen. There's nothing that's going to surprise me. We see time linear. God sees it all at once. God already knows your days. Your days have been numbered. He knows how long you're going to live. God knows all the choices you're going to make in your life. There's nothing that surprises God in his sovereignty. Not only is he sovereign over time, but he's also sovereign over nature. I ask you to turn to Matthew chapter 8, because as I was studying this week, it just blew me away. And I want us to see how God is sovereign over nature, starting in verse 23. Jesus has been teaching and all, and so he and his disciples get into a boat. It says, as they got into the boat, his disciples followed him. Suddenly, a violent storm arose on the sea, so that the boat was being swamped by the waters, but Jesus kept sleeping. Let me say that again. A storm comes up. Waves are coming into the boat. The disciples, who many are former fishermen, are freaking out. And what's Jesus doing? Taking a nap. He didn't even wake up, right? He's chilled. He's relaxed. He's just taking a nap. And so the disciples came and woke him up, saying, Lord, save us. We're going to die. Verse 26, he said to them, why are you afraid, you of little faith? Sounds like a crazy question, right? Dude, there's waves coming in the boat. It's a storm. And he says, guys, notice this. The first thing he does when he wakes up, he doesn't do anything about the storm. He does something about the disciples. He says, why are you guys freaking out? Why are you afraid? And here's why I think he said that. If you look back in chapter 8, starting in verse 5, Jesus was walking and a Roman centurion came up to Jesus and said, I have a servant who is sick, who is ill, and would you heal him? And Jesus basically said, well, where do we need to go? And here was that servant's response. We don't have to go anywhere. You're the man. You say the word right here and he'll be healed. You don't have to go there because of who you are. A pagan Roman soldier, a centurion, understood the sovereignty of God. It said, you don't have to go anywhere. Right now you can say the word and he'll be healed. Guess what? Jesus said the word and guess what happened? That moment, his servant was healed. And now Jesus is dealing with his apostles. And they're freaking out about a storm, and they don't have the faith of a pagan Roman centurion. He's going, guys, when are you going to get it? I'm in control. If I'm in the boat, it's going to be okay. I don't care how circumstances look. It's going to be okay. But then to prove that he's sovereign over the storm, I love this. Then he got up and he rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. Jesus basically, finally, after he talked to his disciples, he kind of looked at the storm and said, just stop it, right? Just stop it. Calm. Why? Because God is sovereign over nature. God is also sovereign over people and events. And there's a story that we're familiar with that really shows this. And it has to do with this young guy named Joseph. And you know, Joseph, the man of the coat of many colors, right? Joseph was the 11th of 12 sons from this man, Jacob. And Jacob had 12 sons, and from him would come the 12 tribes of Israel. And something that God had promised to Abraham a couple hundred years earlier, that I'm going to make you into a great nation, it's now going to really happen through Jacob and through his 12 sons. Well, God gives Joseph, the 11th of the 12th, you know, and by the way, he was daddy's favorite because he was the firstborn son of the wife that Jacob loved, and that was Rachel. And so he's daddy's favorite, and God gives him a vision that one day your brothers and your mother and father are going to kneel down to you. They're going to bow down to you. Well, Joseph, being kind of young and stupid, decided to share that with his brothers and his father. And he said, you know, God told me one day all you guys are going to bow down to me. Well, how do you think the brothers took that? So here's what the brothers did. They conspired, first of all, to kill him, and finally they decided just to sell him to a caravan that was headed toward Egypt. And so he's sold now into slavery. He's brought into Egypt. There he is bought by Potiphar, who was in charge of the secret service for Pharaoh. He was in charge of security for Pharaoh, and he becomes a servant in Pharaoh's household. As a servant, he excelled and actually worked his way up to the point where Pharaoh put him in charge of everything and said, you're over everything that I do, so I don't have to worry. I'm not Pharaoh, Potiphar. Put him in charge of everything in his household and said, you just run the household. I have that much trust in you. Now, whenever Joseph was taken, he was 17 years old. So now he's still a young man, and Potiphar's wife gets the hots for Joseph and makes the moves on Joseph. And because Joseph worshiped God, because Joseph was raised right, loved God, wanted to honor God, he said, look, I'm not going to dishonor God, and I'm not going to dishonor my master Potiphar, and he fled. Potiphar's wife made up a story. Joseph now has been accused of trying to hit on Potiphar's wife. Potiphar has him thrown in jail, but it's not the ordinary jail. Because it's Potiphar, and he's in charge of Pharaoh's secret service, Joseph is now put in a prison that's a different prison. It's one for those of Pharaoh's prisoners. It's his prison. And while he's in there, a baker and a wine taster get put in there also. They have a dream. Nobody can interpret it. God gives Joseph the interpretation of the dream. He tells the wine taster, look, you're going to be brought back up and you're going to serve again. Baker, not so good for you. You're going to die, right? And so he gives them the whole thing. And he says to the wine server, he says, look, when you get there, remember me. Well, the wine taster is, put back. He gets his position back, but he totally forgets Joseph. Now, let me ask you this. What would your thoughts be if you were Joseph at that point? All right, God, I've served you as best as I could. I've tried to live for you. I said no to Potiphar's wife. I tried to live with integrity. But God, I was sold into slavery at 17. I was accused of a crime I didn't do. I've been in this prison for 3 years. I interpreted a dream, and I thought that would get me out, but here I sit. What would you think about the sovereignty of God at that point? Well, you know the story. Pharaoh has a dream. The wine taster goes, oops, I forgot to tell you about this dude who can interpret dreams. Joseph comes up. He interprets Pharaoh's dream. Pharaoh says, awesome, you're in charge of the entire kingdom. For the next 7 years, you store the grains, and then after that, you're going to be the one who dishes it out, and you're in charge. 3 years into the famine, it's so bad that his brothers come to buy grain from Pharaoh. And of course, they go before Joseph. And Joseph recognizes them. They don't recognize Joseph. And then through a series of events, finally his father comes over and is there. And guess what all 11 of his brothers and his father did? They bowed down to Joseph. Now think about all the things that had to happen for the dream or the vision that God gave Joseph to occur 17 years later. He had to be put into a place where Potiphar's house, where he could understand the language of Pharaoh and what happened in Pharaoh's court, and then had to be in the right prison to be with the right people in order for his name to be brought up before Pharaoh. And then God had to give him the interpretation of Pharaoh's dream. And then his brothers had to come there because the famine was so bad to get food. And then they bowed down to Joseph. God is sovereign over events. And then, so the question is, well, why did that happen? Why did that happen? Why did God put Joseph through that? Well, here's what we know. They entered into Egypt as 70 people. But God had promised Abraham, I'm going to build a great nation out of you. You don't get much of a nation through 70 people. But they were able to live in some of the most lush area in Egypt, and they flourished. So that when Moses came along a couple hundred years later, over 2 million people came out of Egypt. God used that time there to build his nation. And they were in some of the most lush areas to raise their flocks. And so they had a little extra time on their hand. They had a lot of babies and came out of there with over 2 million people. Now you would ask, okay, Joseph, was it worth it? Well, here's what Joseph said. His brothers came to him after Jacob died, and they thought, oh man, Joseph's going to get even with us. So they come to Joseph and said, look, Daddy said before he died not to punish us, right? He said, listen, chill, guys. Here's what he said. He goes, you meant this for harm, but what you need to understand, you weren't behind all this. This really had nothing to do with you. You meant this for harm, but who? God meant it for good. You can see God orchestrated all of this because he knew exactly what he was doing and where we needed to be and how that needed to happen. And God sovereignly orchestrated all of those events. And so look, guys, no problem. God is a sovereign God that is over all. And so what is our response? How do we respond to the sovereignty of God? First of all, we need to accept it. We need to accept it by faith. The Bible makes it very clear that we walk by faith, which means that when things happen that we don't understand, I just need to trust and have faith in the sovereignty of God. Sometimes whenever we trust God in those situations, we'll see how God was working pretty quickly, or how God is sovereign pretty quickly. Look, the disciples found out almost instantaneously, hey, this guy is sovereign over nature. And they saw his sovereignty almost instantly. Sometimes you're going to go through seasons and you're not going to understand what's going on in your life. And you're going to say, is God really working all these things out for good? And you're not going to understand his sovereignty for a while. Joseph, it took 17 years for him to understand the sovereignty of God and how God had sovereignly orchestrated all of those events. But what did he do, man? He remained faithful to God. He trusted God all along the way. And by faith, he just trusted that God was doing something even though he couldn't see it. And let me also say this. There will be things that happen in our life that we will never understand this side of heaven. And in those times, we have got to trust in the sovereignty of God. Here's what it says in Romans 8:28. For we know that all things work together for the good of those who love God and who are called according to his purpose. God can say that because he's sovereignly in control. But notice the qualifier. Here's the good news. We know that all things will work for the good. That's good news. But here's the qualifier for those who love God. You see, I can't live in disobedience and expect God to sovereignly work all things out for my good. He is probably going to let me deal with the consequences of some of my actions. But if I remain faithful, if I walk in faith, he's going to work all things together for the good of those who are called according to his purpose. Number one, accept it. Number two, leverage it. What do I mean by that? If God really is sovereign and he calls you to do something, step out in faith and do it. He's big enough to get it done through you. We don't say, well, I could never do jobs partnership. I'm just kind of shy. I'm more of an introvert. No. If he calls you to do it, if he lays on your heart, he's going to equip you to do it. He's big enough to make it happen. Trust God and do what he's called you to do. He has a plan for your life, and he wants you to make a difference for the kingdom. And then thirdly, celebrate it. We have a God who knows us intimately and has sovereignly called us to be his children. Look, the fact that you're in church today is because God sovereignly drew you here. Let me say this. The only reason we're believers is because God sovereignly drew us. The Bible says very clearly, no one comes to the Father unless he draws them. And God loved you so much that he drew you to himself, and that's something to celebrate. In fact, look at Romans 11:36 in your notes. Paul is just celebrating God, worshiping God. He's saying, for from him and through him and to him are all things. That sounds like a worship song we would sing. To him be the glory forever. Amen. And Paul is worshiping the sovereignty, God who is sovereign. Now, it's not in your notes, but I was thinking about it this week. Because